as referencing to the movement as one of blood and iron. So in the next couple of slides, you will notice some of his more famous quotes. I would ask you that you particularly read them and kind of pay attention to the last two on the second page, because they're a little, I don't know, a little bit of foreshadowing there. So in step one of German unification, you have the Danish War that breaks out in 1864. In this one, we kind of referenced it yesterday, yesterday's PowerPoint, but Denmark tried to once again take back the area known as Schleswig-Holstein, and in this particular battle with Denmark, you actually have Prussia and Austria working together to defeat the Danes, hopefully once and for all, and this end result is the Peace of Vienna. Feel free to try to expand this map and make sense of it. It might be one of the more convoluted ones that have ever existed, but it certainly is colorful. In a kind of unique turn of events, with step two of the unification, you have an Austro-Prussian War that breaks out in 1866, which is also called the 7 Weeks' War. In this particular battle, you essentially have Bismarck picking a fight with Austria to once and for all get them out of German affairs. And the Prussian army is, at this point, superior to Austrian forces. And so Bismarck, when they are able to kind of overtake them in 7 weeks' time, he lets Austria off relatively easily, and you can see how they divide up the locations of Schleswig and Holstein. So in return for getting that, Bismarck basically tells Austria, you have this, but now you need to agree to stay out of German politics forever. And for the most part, they will do that. In step three, you have the creation of a Northern German Confederation, because not all the areas in Germany are quite ready to be unified altogether. In the north, you have mostly a Protestant group, which is certainly a group that Bismarck is much more aligned with. He has some issues with the Catholic Church, and we'll get to that later on. This confederation will recognize William as the king of this confederation and Bismarck as the chancellor. And this formation comes following the victory of Prussia. And Bismarck, when he is able to eliminate Austria, kind of in step two, he goes even a step further and eliminates them from this German confederation, their influence. He then puts in this new confederation in place. This is called the Peace of Prague, which has a two-house legislation with a lower house that's comprised of members elected through universal suffrage. So that's a unique element in the Germanic states in 1867. The southern areas remain, at this point, still in alliance with Prussia. And then we get to number 4, the Ems Dispatch, which is, as historians would say, a catalyst for war, and this is kind of an interesting little tale. Bismarck needed the other half of Germany, the southern part, to basically come into the fold and be willing to be part of a unified Germany. And so he kind of comes up with this little bit of a plan. In 1868, you have this revolt in Spain, and the biggest issue is that the Spanish leaders want their prince, who happened to be a cousin to the Kaiser of Germany and Catholic, they wanted him to be their new king. France had issues with this, primarily because they didn't like kind of this Eastern influence coming back into the West as they saw it. And so France protests this, and his name is withdrawn. The French ambassador actually will ask Kaiser Wilhelm at the city of Ems to apologize to the French leader, Napoleon III, for supporting his cousin, which, if you guys think about it, I mean, how ludicrous is that? The French were so appalled that his name had been put in place, and they can't believe the Kaiser would support it. And so they're like, you must apologize because we are offended. Bismarck then gets a hold of what's known as the Ems Dispatch, and he doctors the telegram from Kaiser Wilhelm, which was supposed to be an apology. He gets a hold of it, he doctors it to the French ambassador, and it makes it seem as though the Kaiser had insulted Napoleon III. I never did find out what actually happens between Wilhelm and Bismarck when Wilhelm finds out about this. At any rate, France and Germany felt that each other had actually insulted the one versus the other, and so a week later, France declares war. So really, what does this mean? Bismarck totally doctors this telegram to make it look like there was an insult that occurred and get a fight to break out, because that's what he needs. He wants to get a fight to break out to try to get nationalist fervor in the southern part of Germany. So when this battle breaks out in 1870, we call it the Franco-Prussian War, and you can see kind of the propaganda picture on the right as far as the Prussian abuses on French women and whatnot. And in the course of about 2 years, you will get South Germany, precisely the area that did not want to supposedly come into the fold. They will rally support behind Prussia and the northern part of the German Confederation. And this will build up this nationalist fervor that Bismarck was hoping for. And ultimately, that's going to help get them one step closer to unification. In this picture, you guys see an image of kind of the German mythological character, Hermann the German, who I'm personally a big fan of. There's a wonderful statue of him in New Ulm, and if you know anyone taking German class, they can certainly ask about Hermann the German, but or maybe ask me in class tomorrow, and I'll give you a little side thing about Hermann. The battle actually winds down in 1871, or the conflict, I should say, and this is supposed to say Bismarck and Napoleon III after Sedan, which is where technically Napoleon III was actually captured. Nothing happens to him, so these two leaders kind of get together and talk it out. But this basically marks the end of the battle. The Treaty of Frankfurt in 1871 is the result of the collapse of the Second French Empire, which was basically starved out by this battle by the Germans, and you get the creation of the Third French Empire. The Italians take Rome and make it their capital, which, as I said before, the French had kind of controlled for a time, and maybe it seemed like they were willing to have a partnership, but ultimately they wanted the French out of there. Russia puts warships back into the Black Sea and violates the Treaty of Paris after the Crimean War. France pays a huge indemnity and was occupied German troops until it paid. Maybe you guys are starting to see a pattern of indemnities being forced upon countries here. And then finally, France cedes the Alsace-Lorraine to Germany, which was a region rich in iron deposits with a flourishing textile industry, which I kind of laugh about these last two because if you think about the history between France and Germany, this whole idea of paying indemnities and putting your people in other people's industrial areas is certainly going to play out a couple of times over the next few conflicts. In an extra flair of the dramatic, Kaiser Wilhelm I is actually has his coronation and it becomes German emperor in Versailles Hall of Mirrors, no less. So not only do the French lose, but then the Germans come in and crown their emperor in the Hall of Mirrors. I think it's kind of funny. In this dramatic work, you have Prussian Junkers, the nobility, of course, swearing their allegiance to the Kaiser. And in case you probably haven't guessed already, Bismarck is actually from this Junker Prussian group, so a member of nobility. And in case you don't know, the Reichstag is going to be the new name for the German government at this time. And you probably remember that from World War II history of what you guys know, but this is when it comes into play. And Bismarck is certainly going to use the Reichstag as kind of his little toy for the next several years. Perhaps one of the more damaging things that Bismarck does when he kind of comes into that secondary leadership position is develop something called the Kulturkampf, which is an anti-Catholic program. And remember, he's a Protestant from the north. He's never been a big fan of Catholics, and we certainly know the history between Catholics and Protestants in the Germanic states goes back centuries. He takes the education and marriage of Germans out of the hands of the clergy, and he says that the only marriages that are actually recognized would be civil marriages. So if you want to get married in a church, you can do that, but it's not going to be recognized as a legal marriage under German law. The Jesuits are expelled from Germany, and the education of Catholic priests would actually be under the supervision of the German government. You also at this time have quite a few German Catholics who will be leaving Germany to either come over to the U.S. or go to other parts of Europe. So one area example, in Minnesota, for example, New Ulm has quite a strong contingent of German Catholics and obviously a strong contingent of German Lutherans. But you will get, even in certain pockets of Minnesota, German Catholics and Lutherans who don't trust each other. And a lot of this seems to actually go back to this time period in the late 1800s where you kind of have the Catholics in Germany viewed almost as villains. And so you'll have a lot of these beliefs coming over to America. Eventually, Pope Leo XIII will meet with Bismarck enough, no word if they actually played chess like this, but He will eventually be able to convince Bismarck to call off this anti-Catholic campaign. I don't really know what some of the backroom dealings were, but certainly I'm guessing the church had to do something for the German government in return. By 1888, you have a new Kaiser coming in. That's Kaiser Wilhelm II. He actually does not like Bismarck, and he really doesn't like Bismarck's friendly relations with the Russians and wanted to have a more expansionist kind of foreign policy. He's big into the military. And if you guys look at the dates of his reign, this is the Kaiser that, of course, will be in charge during World War I. And so he is very much part of the buildup of this hugely successful, and I guess you could say mostly successful, German industrial complex. This is kind of an interesting little family tree. Shows you all of Queen Victoria's grandchildren, if you guys can kind of figure it out. And if you look certainly in the bottom half, you can see how many of them you probably recognize certain other leaders throughout Europe at this time. And that's why a lot of people say as you get into World War I, sometimes World War I is called the family feud, because Queen Victoria has so many kids, and then her kids have so many kids, and many of these children and grandchildren are going to be put in charge of royal houses throughout Europe. In this picture, you have kind of a cartoon showing Bismarck's forced resignation in 1890. And so now we get into the rest of Europe in the late 1800s and what's going on with kind of various nationalist movements. We know that by this point, Austrian Empire is still struggling quite a bit with different nationalities, as you guys can see from this map. And they're still trying to kind of come to some compromise with different groups in their location. Eventually, the Austrian monarchy will come to terms with the Magyar minority group, and you'll get a dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary in 1867. So the government was actually, Hungary's